Fog still clung to Coronado when a whisper cut the dawn. In a cracked wooden crate lay a soaked German Shepherd pup, shivering, stubborn, somehow still trying to speak. He wasn't supposed to last the night. Within days, he would become a voice that turned a silent Navy base into something no one expected. He wouldn't learn commands first. He would learn hearts. He'd talk back to duty, harmonize with gunfire, and carry a grieving child's pain like a hymn. What happens next will make you cry and believe in second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, comment the city you're watching from, and if you believe in stories of loyalty, healing, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel. November fog rolled in from the Pacific and wrapped Naval Amphibious Base Coronado in a cold gray veil, muffling boots, engines, and the distant breath of the sea. Senior Chief Caleb Walker crossed the old K-9 training yard before sunrise, moving with the quiet precision of a man who had learned long ago that noise could get people killed. He was 43, an active-duty Navy SEAL with broad shoulders, a weathered face, short dark brown hair clipped close to the scalp, and a clean-shaven jaw that looked carved more by grief than by age. His blue-gray eyes were steady when others watched him, but empty when they did not. 3 weeks earlier, he had returned to duty after a training injury that still sent a sharp ache through his left knee whenever the weather turned wet. The doctors had cleared his body. No one had cleared the room in his chest where Ranger used to live. Ranger had been his German Shepherd K-9 partner overseas, a powerful sable dog with a black muzzle, intelligent eyes, and the kind of courage that made men believe angels sometimes wore fur. 3 months ago, during a night operation, Ranger had broken position and shoved Caleb clear before an explosion tore through the darkness. Caleb came home breathing. Ranger did not. Since then, Caleb had followed orders, shaved clean, laced his boots, saluted when required, and answered when spoken to. But inside, he moved like a ghost wearing a uniform. He almost missed the sound. It came from beyond the rusted fence near the unused equipment shed, a thin, broken whimper beneath the hiss of fog and the distant rumble of a transport truck. Caleb stopped. The base continued around him, disciplined and indifferent, but that small cry slipped through him like a hook. He turned toward a stack of old wooden crates half covered by a faded tarp. One crate sat apart from the others, damp, cracked along one corner, its lid fastened with a bent metal latch. Something inside scratched weakly, then released a strange little sound. Not quite a cry, not quite a bark, but a trembling string of notes, as if whatever was trapped there had decided it would argue with death. Caleb crouched slowly. "Easy," he murmured, though he did not know whether he was speaking to the crate or to himself. His gloved hand closed around the latch. For one breath, he saw Ranger again. Dust on his coat, ears forward, body launching into danger with no thought of return. Caleb's throat tightened. Then the crate whimpered again, louder this time, stubborn as a spark under ash. He pried the latch open. A German Shepherd puppy lay curled inside on a strip of soaked canvas. He was no more than 8 weeks old, small enough to fit against Caleb's forearm, with golden-brown fur darkened by rain, a black saddle beginning to form along his back, oversized paws and amber eyes too bright for such a frightened little body. He shivered hard, but when Caleb reached for him, the puppy lifted his head and released another odd cascade of sound. A whine, a soft growl, then a tiny rising yip that almost sounded like complaint. Even half-frozen, he had the outrage of a general denied breakfast. Despite himself, Caleb gave a faint breath of amusement. "You've got a lot to say for someone abandoned in a box." The puppy stared at him, offended and hopeful at once. Caleb unzipped his jacket and lifted him carefully against his chest. The little dog stopped shaking for half a second, then pressed his wet muzzle beneath Caleb's chin. A low hum came from him, warm and sorrowful, vibrating through Caleb's ribs like a voice returning from a far valley. By the time Dr. Laura Bennett arrived, the fog had begun to pale around the edges. Laura was 35, a military veterinarian with a tall, lean frame, warm brown skin, dark auburn hair pulled into a practical braid, and hazel eyes that missed very little. She had the calm hands of someone who had stitched torn flesh, held dying animals, and still chosen gentleness as her daily uniform. People on base trusted her because she never wasted words, but every wounded creature seemed to understand her before she spoke. She knelt beside Caleb, opened her medical kit, and examined the puppy with practiced care. Male, about 8 weeks. Cold, dehydrated, but no fractures, no obvious trauma. The puppy looked at her and made a soft rolling sound, almost like he was answering the diagnosis. Laura paused. "That's unusual." Caleb looked down. "He's been doing that since I opened the crate." Laura touched the puppy's chest, then glanced at Caleb's face. "He calms when you speak." Caleb swallowed, uncomfortable with how true that sounded. "Most dogs do." "Not like this," she said quietly. The puppy shifted in Caleb's jacket, tucked his head against the place where Ranger's old tag still hung beneath Caleb's shirt, and released one more small hum. It was not happy. It was not afraid. It was something between recognition and prayer. Caleb stood there in the whitening fog, holding this ruined little scrap of life, and felt the silence inside him answer. He had not meant to name the dog. Names were doors, and Caleb had sworn never to open that kind again. But the puppy looked up, amber eyes fixed on him, and made a tiny sound that seemed to bounce out of Caleb's own grief. Caleb brushed one thumb over the wet fur between his ears. "Echo," he said softly. "That's what you are." The puppy gave a short, certain bark, as if the name had been his all along. Echo spent his first nights at Coronado in the eastern K9 Bay, inside a clean temporary kennel with a heat lamp above the door and a folded wool blanket that smelled faintly of disinfectant, leather, and old dogs who had gone to work before him. By the second morning, his fur had dried into a soft, golden-brown coat with a dark saddle along his back, his ears still too large for his little head, one standing proudly while the other leaned like a tired flag. He had the oversized paws of a dog who would one day become powerful, but for now he moved with the uneven bravery of a pup still learning where the floor ended and the world began. Dr. Laura Bennett checked him twice a day, recording his temperature, appetite, hydration, and the strange pattern of his voice. She did not call it barking anymore. Barking was simple. Echo's sounds had shape. He gave short questioning yips when someone approached too fast, soft rolling hums when a voice lowered, and tiny offended grumbles whenever Laura touched the thermometer. "You are the smallest patient I've ever met with the attitude of an admiral," she told him one morning. Echo replied with a sharp chirp. Laura wrote in her chart, responsive to tone, unusually calm around steady voices, distressed by harsh commands. Caleb Walker read that line later and felt it settle under his ribs. Harsh commands were the language he knew best. Orders had held his life together when grief would have scattered it like ash. But Echo seemed to live by a different law. By the third day, several SEALs and sailors had drifted toward the K9 Bay as if the kennel had become a chapel with a very furry priest. One of them was Petty Officer Nolan Reed, a 26-year-old communications specialist with sandy blonde hair, pale skin freckled from too much California sun, and a nervous smile that appeared whenever he did not know where to put his fear. Nolan was lean, quick-handed, and polite to everyone, but Caleb had noticed how the young man flinched at sudden metal clang since returning from his first overseas deployment. That morning, Nolan stopped by with a clipboard and tried to sound casual. "Heard the little guy talks back." Caleb stood near the kennel door, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "He makes noise." Echo sat inside the kennel and watched Nolan with unsettling focus. Nolan laughed once, too quickly. "Don't we all?" A mechanic's wrench dropped somewhere beyond the bay, ringing against concrete. Nolan's shoulders jerked before he could hide it. Echo immediately rose, waddled to the front of the kennel, and released a low, steady hum. Not loud, not playful. It was a sound with weight in it, soft enough to fit into the hollow left by a man's pride. Nolan stared at the puppy, all humor draining from his face. "That's weird," he whispered. Caleb noticed the young man's hand had stopped trembling. Laura, standing just behind them with her medical bag, noticed too. She crouched beside the kennel. "He isn't reacting to the noise," she said quietly. "He's reacting to Nolan." Caleb did not answer. He did not like how quickly that sentence found him. That afternoon, Ray Thompson arrived with the subtlety of a loose engine belt. Ray was 58, a civilian mechanic who had worked on the base long enough that no one remembered whether he had been hired, adopted, or simply grown out of the motor pool like an old oak with grease under its bark. He was broad through the chest, thick around the middle, with sun-browned skin, a square face, a gray mustache that seemed permanently suspicious, and hair the color of steel wool, hidden beneath a faded navy cap. His hands were scarred, rough, and always smelled of machine oil and coffee. Ray complained about everything: paperwork, weather, young sailors, old trucks, new trucks, and especially people who called him before lunch. Yet, he was the man who fixed a widow's car for free, left sandwiches for night guards, and pretended not to care about every stray animal that crossed the base fence. He stepped into the K9 bay holding a clean blanket under one arm and a small bowl of warm chicken under the other. "I heard Coronado's loudest new recruit is refusing standard discipline," he announced. Caleb looked at the bowl. "That from the mess hall?" Ray shrugged. "That depends on whether anyone official asks." Echo pressed his nose through the kennel bars and gave 3 eager squeaks. Ray bent down, squinting at him. "Look at that. Tiny body, giant mouth. Reminds me of half the officers I've met." Laura tried not to smile and failed. Caleb's mouth moved almost imperceptibly, the closest thing to laughter most men had seen from him in months. They tried basic commands after lunch because the Navy loved a form, a schedule, and the comforting illusion that life could be trained into obedience. Caleb opened the kennel and led Echo onto a rubber mat in the small exercise lane. "Sit," he said. Echo looked up at him. His good ear stood, the lazy one folded sideways. "Sit," Caleb repeated, firmer. Echo lowered his rear halfway, changed his mind, and gave a thoughtful little growl. Ray, leaning against the wall, nodded solemnly. "He's reviewing the chain of command." "Down," Caleb said. Echo blinked. "Stay." Echo yawned. Laura watched carefully, not amused now, but fascinated. Caleb's jaw tightened. He had trained dogs that could clear rooms, locate explosives, and follow silent hand signals under fire. This puppy, apparently, had decided that military law was only a suggestion. Caleb pointed to the mat. "Echo, sit." His voice sharpened. Echo's tail stopped moving. The puppy did not cower, but his eyes changed. The brightness dimmed, replaced by wary stillness. Laura stepped in gently. "Caleb." He exhaled through his nose, the old frustration rising too fast, too familiar. He had not been angry at Echo. He had been angry at a world where dogs died following orders and men survived to give them again. He lowered himself to one knee, ignoring the flare of pain in his left leg. "Easy," he said softer. "No one's mad at you." Echo tilted his head, then stepped forward and pressed his small body against Caleb's knee. A warm hum trembled out of him, and the hard line of Caleb's shoulders loosened despite his best effort. That night, rain swept in from the Pacific, tapping against the windows of the barracks and turning the training yard lights into blurred halos. Caleb returned late from debrief, carrying the day's silence on his back. He told himself he was only checking the kennel because Echo was still under observation. That was all. Duty, not attachment. Procedure, not weakness. But when he reached the K9 bay, Echo was already awake, sitting on the blanket Ray had smuggled in, staring toward the door as though he had been waiting for one set of footsteps among hundreds. Caleb sat on the floor outside the open kennel and removed one boot, then the other. Echo crawled out and settled beside them, resting his chin on the worn leather. Caleb's chest tightened at the sight. Ranger had done the same thing after long missions, guarding Caleb's boots as if they were sacred relics that might wander off without supervision. "Don't start," Caleb whispered. "I know what you're doing." Echo answered with a quiet sigh. Later, when Caleb finally stretched out on the narrow cot in the adjacent handler's room, sleep came like an ambush. He was back overseas, smoke boiling over broken ground, his radio screaming, Ranger's body moving before Caleb could give the command. He saw the flash, felt the blast, heard the silence afterward, the terrible silence where a bark should have been. Caleb woke with a strangled breath, one hand clawing at the sheets, his heart hammering like boots on metal stairs. Echo was already there. Somehow the puppy had climbed from the blanket and pressed himself against Caleb's chest, trembling not with fear but with effort, as if holding back the whole dark ocean with 8 pounds of fur and stubbornness. Then came the sound, a long, low note, tender and steady, almost a lullaby. Caleb shut his eyes. His hand found Echo's back. "It was my fault," he whispered into the rain-dim room, the words breaking loose at last. "Ranger died because of me." Echo did not answer like a human would. He did not deny, excuse, or explain. He only laid his small head over Caleb's heart and kept humming until the storm outside sounded less like gunfire and more like water washing something clean. The morning after the storm, Coronado woke beneath a veil of silver mist, with the Pacific breathing cold air across the training yards and the base lights fading one by one into dawn. Caleb Walker did not mention what had happened in the handler's room, and Echo, mercifully, did not seem interested in exposing a Navy SEAL's private collapse to the whole command. The puppy simply followed him with that strange, solemn joy of young dogs, trotting beside his boots as if he had been assigned there by heaven, tail high, one ear standing straight and the other still folding whenever the wind touched it. By then, Echo had gained a little weight. His golden-brown coat looked warmer, the black saddle on his back more defined, and his amber eyes had sharpened into something almost unnerving. Not adult wisdom, not yet, but the bright awareness of a creature who noticed everything people tried to hide. "Doctor?" Laura Bennett watched him from the open door of the K-9 bay, her medical clipboard tucked beneath one arm, her auburn braid darkened slightly by the wet air. She had not asked Caleb about the red in his eyes that morning. Laura was the kind of woman who understood that some truths came out only when they were not chased. Instead, she wrote quietly, observed carefully, and let compassion stand near people without cornering them. Ray Thompson, of course, had no such gift for silence. He arrived carrying a dented thermos and a biscuit wrapped in a napkin, his gray mustache twitching with suspicion. "That dog looks better rested than I do," he grumbled. Echo chirped at him. Ray pointed at the puppy. "Don't start with me, Admiral Tiny Paws. I outrank you in the motor pool." Caleb almost smiled, and that almost was enough to make Laura glance up from her notes. For a brief second, the morning felt ordinary, which, on a military base, was its own small miracle. The sound began just before mid-morning, carried from the weapons range beyond the low ridge east of the training yard. A short burst of rifle fire cracked through the fog, then stopped. Another burst followed, sharper this time, echoing over the damp pavement and metal sheds. Echo froze. His tail lowered slightly, not tucked, but still. Laura stepped closer at once. "Caleb." He heard the warning in her voice. Puppies startled easily, wounded creatures even more so. Caleb crouched and touched 2 fingers to Echo's shoulder. "Easy, boy. Range fire. Nothing coming for you." Echo did not look at him. His ears had turned toward the distant cracks, his small body alert, his breathing shallow but not panicked. Another volley rolled through the mist. Several SEALs moving across the yard slowed to watch. Among them was Petty Officer Lucas Grant, a 24-year-old logistics sailor with warm olive skin, close-cropped black hair, a narrow face, and restless brown eyes that always seemed to be searching for the next joke before trouble found him. Lucas was lean and quick, The kind of young man who could make friends in a chow line and enemies only by accident. He had grown up in Phoenix with 3 sisters and a mother who worked double shifts at a hospital, which had left him with a habit of filming small, happy things and sending them home as proof that he was still alive. That morning, seeing the tiny German shepherd standing like a statue beneath the fog, Lucas quietly lifted his phone. Caleb noticed but said nothing. His attention had locked onto Echo. The next burst of gunfire came in a clean rhythm. 3 shots, pause, 2 shots, longer pause. Echo raised his muzzle. For one suspended breath, everyone expected him to bark, cry, or bolt back into the kennel. Instead, the puppy released a low sound from deep in his chest, soft at first, almost a vibration. It rose into a trembling hum, then broke into 2 short yips that matched the empty space between the shots. The range fired again. Echo answered again, not randomly, not wildly. His voice rose and fell around the gunfire, weaving through it like a small thread of gold through black cloth. A long whine followed a distant volley, then a rounded growl, then a bright, sudden bark that made Lucas whisper, "No way." Ray stopped chewing his biscuit. Laura's pen slipped still against her clipboard. Around the yard, men trained to keep moving under pressure simply stopped. Some laughed because the sound was too strange not to laugh at. Others went quiet, their faces shifting as if the puppy had reached into places even their closest friends were not allowed to touch. Echo sang again, and this time his little body seemed to gather the rhythm of the range and give it back changed. The gunfire sounded hard, mechanical, final. Echo's answer sounded alive. Caleb felt something inside him open with a pain so clean it almost became peace. For months, every sharp crack had dragged him backward into smoke and dust, into Ranger's last leap, into the awful silence that followed. But Echo did not treat the sound as an enemy. He did not deny it either. He took the harshness and folded it into something that could be carried. It was absurd. It was impossible. It was a puppy singing to rifles, and yet Caleb had seen men pray with less honesty. "He's not scared," Laura said softly, though her eyes were wet. "He's responding." Ray cleared his throat, suddenly fascinated by the lid of his thermos. "Well," he muttered, "I've heard worse from the bass choir." Echo gave a sharp, offended bark without turning around, and even Caleb laughed then, one short sound that startled a few men more than the puppy's song had. Lucas kept filming, his hand steadier now. When the range went quiet, Echo lowered his head and looked back at Caleb, panting lightly, as if asking whether he had done something useful. Caleb knelt and scratched behind his uneven ears. "You turned gunfire into a hymn, kid," he whispered. "I don't know what Command does with that." By evening, Command found out. Lucas had uploaded a 23-second clip with the caption, "This rescued K9 sings back to the guns." He meant it for friends, maybe his sisters, maybe his mother after another long hospital shift. But the internet, that wild town square where angels and wolves shared the same road, seized the video before sunset. At first it was a few thousand views, then 50,000, then 500,000. By the time Caleb finished his evening report, Lucas was standing outside the K9 bay, pale with excitement and terror. "Senior Chief," he said, holding up his phone like evidence at his own trial, "I think the dog is famous." Comments poured in faster than anyone could read them. Veterans wrote that they had not cried in years until a little dog answered the sound they still heard in their sleep. Military wives wrote that Echo sounded like every goodbye they had ever swallowed. Older viewers wrote blessings. Dog lovers demanded updates. Someone called him the tiny voice of Coronado, and the phrase spread like sparks in dry grass. The next morning, Commander Mark Sullivan arrived at the K9 bay with the 2 officers behind him and no warmth in his face. Sullivan was 47, tall and narrow-shouldered, with iron-gray hair cut close, pale blue eyes, and a clean, angular face that looked as if it had been designed for official photographs rather than comfort. His uniform was immaculate, his posture exact, and his voice carried the polished calm of a man who believed emotions were useful only after they had been filed correctly. He had spent most of his career managing special programs, and people respected him because he made hard decisions without flinching. They did not love him, but he had never seemed to ask for that. He watched Echo through the kennel gate while the puppy stared back and gave a small, questioning hum. Sullivan's expression did not change. "Extraordinary animal," he said. Caleb's jaw tightened at the word animal, though he knew it was technically true. Laura stepped forward. "Commander, Echo is still very young. His responses are unusual, but he needs stability." Sullivan turned to her. "Doctor, unusual responses are exactly why he needs evaluation." Ray, standing near the tool bench, muttered, "Evaluation is what people call it when they haven't decided how to ruin a good thing yet." Sullivan ignored him. He opened a folder and handed Caleb a printed order. "Senior Chief Walker, this dog is now considered a valuable behavioral asset. He will be transferred to the Nevada K-9 Assessment Facility for military suitability review." The word asset landed colder than the morning fog. Echo pressed his nose through the bars and hummed once, low and uncertain. Caleb looked from the order to the puppy, and the song from the range seemed suddenly very far away. By the next morning, Echo's song had escaped Coronado like a little flame riding the wind, and no wall, gate, or regulation could call it back. The K-9 bay, once a quiet corner of disinfectant, old leashes, and disciplined routine, became the strangest mailroom on the base. Messages arrived through official channels, public affairs inboxes, handwritten envelopes, and printed screenshots carried in by sailors who pretended they were not emotional. Caleb Walker stood beside Echo's kennel with his arms folded, watching Laura Bennett sort through the growing pile on a metal table. Echo sat at his feet, cleaner now, stronger now, his golden-brown fur brushed smooth, his black saddle dark against his small back, his amber eyes tracking every envelope as if each one carried a scent of sorrow. Some letters made the men laugh. One retired chief from Ohio wrote that Echo sounded exactly like his first wife before coffee. Ray Thompson read that one aloud twice, wheezing so hard his gray mustache nearly surrendered. Others made the room go still. A Vietnam veteran wrote that he had slept 6 straight hours after hearing Echo answer the gunfire because for once the sound in his head had not ended in silence. A military widow in Georgia wrote that her husband used to whistle to their shepherd every dawn, and Echo's voice had brought back the kitchen light of a life she thought she had lost forever. Caleb listened without speaking. Praise made him uneasy. Miracles made him suspicious. He had seen too many good things become paperwork, too many living creatures become resources, too many loyal hearts sent where orders pointed and buried where flags folded. Yet each message seemed to prove what Laura had said from the beginning. Echo was not reacting to noise alone. He was reaching toward the wound beneath it. Near noon, Lucas Grant hurried in carrying a small bundle of mail tied with a rubber band, his young face pale from lack of sleep and bright from the terror of accidental fame. "Public Affairs asked me to stop touching the internet," he said. "Then they gave me more internet to print." Ray snorted from the corner, where he was repairing a kennel latch that did not need repairing. "That's the Navy. If something catches fire, first they label it." Laura took the bundle, but one envelope slipped free and landed near Caleb's boot. It was cream-colored, bent at the corners, addressed in uneven pencil. No official stamp, no typed label, only a child's careful effort. Caleb picked it up. The return address read Ben Whitaker, near Bozeman, Montana. Something about the handwriting held him. It was not messy in the way children were careless. It was shaky in the way courage shook when forced onto paper. He opened it slowly. Inside was a folded letter and a small photograph. The photo showed a thin boy of about 9 standing beside an older woman on a snow-covered porch. The boy had light brown hair that fell across his forehead, pale skin dotted with faint freckles, and large gray eyes too solemn for a child's face. He wore a blue winter coat zipped to his chin and held a red knit cap in both hands like he had forgotten what hands were for. The woman beside him was tall, but slightly stooped, with silver hair braided over one shoulder, weathered fair skin, and blue eyes that looked tired but kind. She had one hand on the boy's shoulder, protective without trapping him. On the back, someone had written, "Ben and Grandma Martha. First snow after Dad." Caleb read the letter once, then again, and by the third time the words had begun to blur. "Dear Senior Chief Walker, my name is Ben Whitaker. I am 9 years old. My Grandma Martha says I should write what I cannot say out loud. My dad was named Aaron Whitaker. He was a rescue worker. He had brown hair like mine, but he was taller and stronger and laughed so loud the windows shook. Last winter he went out in a snowstorm to help a family whose truck went off the road. He saved them, but he did not come home. Since then, I do not talk much because every word feels like it has to walk through snow. Grandma says grief is not bad manners, but I think it makes people tired. I saw the video of Echo singing to the guns. I do not know why, but it sounded like he knew about loud things that take people away. It made me feel like maybe my sadness was not stuck inside me forever. Could you please tell Echo thank you? I think he understood something I could not explain. From Ben. Caleb lowered the page. For a moment, the K9 bay disappeared. There was only a boy in Montana, a grandmother standing in the wreckage of a family, and a puppy whose small voice had crossed deserts, mountains, wires, and screens to sit beside them in the dark. Echo nudged Caleb's boot and gave a soft hum, as if he had felt the letter pass through Caleb before Caleb had spoken a word. Caleb crouched, the paper still in his hand. "Your reaching people will never meet," he whispered. Echo blinked up at him, utterly innocent of the burden of becoming hope. Laura read the letter after him. Her face changed as she moved through each line, the professional calm softening into something older and more wounded. "This is what I'm talking about," she said. "He's not a performance. He's not a trick. People are responding because he gives sound to grief." Caleb looked toward the yard where the fog had lifted and the sky over Coronado burned white with noon light. "Command won't see that." Laura folded the letter carefully, as if it were a field dressing over an open wound. "Then we make them see it." Before Caleb could answer, Commander Mark Sullivan entered the bay with 2 officers from the K9 program and a public affairs lieutenant. Sullivan's iron-gray hair was perfectly combed, his uniform sharp enough to seem untouched by weather, his pale eyes already measuring the room like a problem to be solved. In one hand he carried a folder stamped with red routing marks. Echo's ears dipped. Ray's face hardened. Lucas suddenly found the floor fascinating. Sullivan stopped in front of Caleb. "Senior Chief Walker, the situation has accelerated. Due to public visibility and behavioral significance, Echo will be transferred to the Nevada K9 Assessment Facility within 72 hours. He handed over the document. "Temporary custody remains with this command until transport." Laura stepped forward immediately. "Commander, he is 8 weeks old. His stress profile is still developing. Isolation and pressure testing at that age could damage him." Sullivan's gaze moved to her. "Dr. Bennett, the facility is equipped for juvenile assessment." "Assessment for military suitability," she replied. "That is not the same as care." Sullivan's expression cooled. His response to weapons fire suggests unusual resilience. Laura lifted her tablet with clipped restraint. No, his cortisol reading spiked after the range exposure, then dropped only when Caleb spoke and Echo reoriented to human emotion. He is not seeking combat stimulus. He is seeking connection after distress. Ray muttered, "Even I understood that, and I once tried to fix a coffee maker with duct tape." Sullivan ignored him again, which Caleb suspected was the only safe response. The Navy cannot ignore a potentially valuable asset. Caleb felt the word strike like a slap. Echo stood between his boots and gave one small, uncertain whine. Laura's voice sharpened. If you force him into attack training or prolonged isolation, you may destroy the very trait everyone finds valuable. Sullivan closed the folder. That determination will be made in Nevada. The room went quiet, not with peace, but with the terrible obedience of people trained to swallow protest. Caleb looked down at Ben's letter still folded in his hand. Ranger had died obeying the logic of war. Echo, somehow, had been born speaking another language entirely. In 72 hours, that language might be locked behind a door and studied until it forgot how to sing. Sullivan turned to leave. "Prepare the animal for transfer." Caleb did not move. He was still a Navy SEAL. He knew the shape of command, the gravity of orders, the cost of defiance. But Echo pressed against his leg, warm and trembling, and Caleb understood that this was no longer only about a puppy in a kennel. It was about every silent room that little voice had entered. It was about Ben in Montana, Laura's data, Ray's hidden kindness, Nolan's steadied hands, and the ghost of Ranger still walking somewhere inside him. For the first time in months, Caleb did not feel empty. He felt divided, like a blade held between two vows: obey the order or protect the friend. Cold rain fell over Coronado that night with the patience of something old and unforgiving, tapping the kennel roof, silvering the concrete, and turning every light on the base into a blurred yellow star. Caleb Walker stayed after the others had gone, seated on the floor outside Echo's kennel with his back against the cinder-block wall and the transfer order folded beside his boot. 72 hours had become less than 24. By sunrise, the paperwork would move again. By noon, someone would begin preparing a transport crate. By tomorrow night, if no one stopped it, Echo would be on a road to Nevada, carried away from the voices that steadied him and into the hands of people who wanted to measure the miracle until it became a method. Echo lay curled on his blanket under the heat lamp, no longer the soaked, shaking thing Caleb had pulled from a crate, but still impossibly small against the machinery of command. His golden-brown coat glowed softly in the amber light, one ear upright and the other folded, his oversized paws twitching as he dreamed. Caleb watched him and tried to build a wall inside himself. A SEAL did not bargain with grief. A SEAL adapted. A SEAL obeyed the mission. Yet every rule Caleb had trusted now stood like a row of stone statues, solemn and useless, while a puppy breathed in front of him like the last warm coal in a dying fire. He reached beneath his shirt and pulled out the old metal tag he had carried for 3 months. Ranger's tag was scratched, darkened at the edge by heat, the stamped letters worn beneath Caleb's thumb. Ranger, K9. No metal had ever felt heavier, no prayer had ever stayed so silent. He had avoided remembering the whole night, because memory was a country with minds beneath the grass. But the rain called it back anyway. It had not been rain then. It had been dust, hot wind, and a moonless sky torn open by muzzle flashes. Ranger had been 6 years old, a full-grown German shepherd with deep sable fur, a black mask around his intelligent eyes, and a body built like loyalty itself. He had trusted Caleb's voice more than fear, more than pain, more than the thunder of the world. On that final operation overseas, Caleb had given the command to hold. Ranger had obeyed for half a second. Then his ears snapped forward, his body lowered, and he lunged. Caleb remembered the shove of 80 pounds of muscle against his leg, the sudden impact that knocked him sideways, the flash that swallowed the doorway, and the terrible ringing afterward. When Caleb crawled through the smoke, Ranger was already still. His body had made a shield of itself. His eyes were open, not accusing, not afraid, only fixed on Caleb with the same faithful question dogs had asked humans since the beginning of fire. "Are you alive?" Caleb had been alive. That was the wound. He had carried it home in his bones, polished it with silence, hidden it beneath rank, routine, and the merciless dignity of clean boots. He could accept injury. He could accept death. But being saved by a creature who loved him more than its own life had become a debt no living man knew how to repay. The kennel gate creaked. Caleb looked up. Echo was awake. The puppy stood there in the opening Laura had left unlatched for supervised movement, blinking sleep from his amber eyes. He did not bounce toward Caleb as he usually did. He approached slowly, as if entering sacred ground where even small paws had to be careful. Caleb closed his fist around Ranger's tag. "Go back to sleep," he whispered. Echo ignored the order, which by now was almost tradition. He climbed into Caleb's lap with clumsy determination, placed both front paws against Caleb's chest, and sniffed at the clenched hand. "No," Caleb said too sharply. Echo froze. Caleb shut his eyes and softened his voice. "Sorry, not you." Echo waited. Then, with the gentleness of a child handling glass, he nudged Caleb's fist open with his nose. The tag slid into view. Echo sniffed it once, then took it carefully between his tiny teeth. Caleb's first instinct was to stop him, but something in the puppy's posture held him still. Echo did not chew. He did not play. He carried the tag a few inches away, set it on Caleb's open palm, and pressed his muzzle over it. Then came the sound. Low, trembling, almost too soft to survive the rain. It was not the song from the weapons range. It was not the playful complaint that made Ray laugh. This was a broken little note, a sound shaped like mourning. Caleb felt it travel through the tag, through his hand, through the locked room in his chest where Ranger had been waiting. His breath came apart. He bowed his head over the puppy and finally let the words fall. "I told him to hold. He didn't. He saved me anyway." Echo's hum deepened, sorrowful and steady. Caleb swallowed hard. "I thought if I cared about you, I'd be betraying him." The puppy lifted his eyes, bright as lanterns in stormlight. Caleb gave a bitter half-smile through the ache. "Stupid, isn't it?" Echo answered with one small huff, perfectly timed, as if agreeing that humans were indeed a poorly designed species. The door opened quietly behind him. Laura Bennett stepped inside with a sealed folder under her arm, rain freckling her navy jacket and loosening strands from her auburn braid. She saw Caleb's face, saw the tag in his hand, saw Echo tucked against him, and her expression changed without pity. That was one of Laura's rare gifts. She could witness pain without making it feel naked. "I finished the report," she said gently. Caleb wiped his face with the heel of one hand, not bothering to pretend it was rain. "And?" Laura sat on the bench across from him. Echo's responses are strongest around acute emotional distress, not weapon stimuli, not aggression cues. Human distress. Veterans with startle response, children displaying grief patterns, personnel under suppressed anxiety. His vocalizations appear to regulate breathing in people nearby. Nolan's pulse dropped after Echo approached him. Yours did too. Caleb looked down at the puppy. Echo yawned, unimpressed by science explaining his ancient profession. Laura placed the folder beside the transfer order. If Sullivan sends him to Nevada for combat suitability, they'll test the wrong thing. Worse, they may punish the right thing out of him. Before Caleb could answer, Ray Thompson shouldered the door open, dripping rain from his cap, carrying a fat envelope and the guilty look of a man who had done something kind and intended to deny it in court. "I don't want a speech," Ray said. "I collected signatures. That's all." He dropped the envelope on the bench. Inside were pages filled with names: SEALs, sailors, handlers, cooks, mechanics, clerks, guards. Beside each name was a sentence. "Echo made me laugh after my brother's funeral. Echo sat with me when I couldn't stop shaking. Echo helped me call my wife and tell her the truth. Echo made the bay feel less haunted." Ray cleared his throat. "Bunch of sentimental nonsense, obviously." Laura smiled faintly. Caleb touched the pages as if they were evidence from a different kind of battlefield. For once, no one in the room made a joke. Near dawn, the rain thinned into a gray mist. Caleb had not slept, but something in him had stopped running. He sat at the metal desk in the K9 office, Ranger's tag beside Laura's report, Ray's signatures stacked beneath the official transfer order. Echo slept under the desk with his chin on Caleb's boot, guarding him from both enemies and paperwork, though he seemed to consider paperwork the greater threat. Caleb wrote carefully, each sentence clean and exact. He did not ask to keep Echo because he loved him, though that truth stood behind every word like a candle behind stained glass. He did not accuse command, did not plead, did not turn a puppy into a weapon against authority. He requested a reassessment of Echo's mission classification based on observed therapeutic response, documented stress regulation, witness statements, and veterinary evaluation. He recommended Echo be removed from combat suitability testing and considered for a pilot animal-assisted recovery program serving active duty personnel, veterans, and children affected by traumatic loss. When he signed his name, his hand did not shake. At 0600, Senior Chief Caleb Walker walked through the wet morning to the administrative office and placed the packet on Commander Sullivan's desk. He stood straight, eyes clear, uniform immaculate, grief no longer hidden but harnessed. "Sir," he said, "I'm not requesting ownership of the dog. I'm requesting that we stop asking him to become a weapon when he has already shown us his mission." Behind him, far down the hall, Echo barked once from the K9 bay, sharp and bright, as if adding his own signature. By the time the final evaluation began, the rain had passed, leaving Coronado washed clean beneath a hard, white morning sky, every puddle holding a broken piece of sun. The assessment room had once been a training classroom near the K9 wing, but Commander Mark Sullivan had turned it into something colder. 2 rows of folding chairs, a steel table, a projector, 3 speakers mounted near the walls, and a rubber mat placed in the center like a tiny battlefield waiting for judgment. Caleb Walker stood near the door in full uniform, shoulders square, jaw clean-shaven, blue-gray eyes steady in the way men became steady when they refused to let themselves shake. Echo sat at his left boot, small and golden brown against the dark floor, one ear high and one still folded, amber eyes moving from face to face as if counting the hearts in the room. "Doctor?" Laura Bennett stood across from Sullivan with her tablet held to her chest, her auburn braid pulled tight, her hazel eyes calm but bright with sleepless anger. Ray Thompson leaned near the back wall with his arms crossed over his broad chest, gray mustache bristling, navy cap low over his brow, looking like a mechanic who had accidentally wandered into a courtroom and already disliked the judge. Beside Sullivan sat Lieutenant Commander Evelyn Price, a new representative from the Navy K9 behavioral program, a woman in her early 40s with dark blonde hair cut bluntly at her jaw, sharp cheekbones, pale skin, and cool green eyes behind rimless glasses. She had the careful posture of someone trained to remove emotion from difficult decisions, but there was a faint softness around her mouth that suggested she had not always succeeded. Next to her was Chief Warrant Officer Daniel Mercer, 51, square-bodied and heavy-browed, with a shaved head, brown skin, and a thick black beard trimmed close. He had spent 20 years around working dogs and carried the quiet seriousness of a man who had buried more K9s than he liked to remember. Sullivan opened the folder in front of him. "This is not a hearing," he said. "This is a suitability review." Ray muttered, "Funny. Feels like a funeral with fluorescent lighting." Caleb did not look back, but the corner of Laura's mouth moved despite everything. Sullivan continued, "We will evaluate the animal's response to controlled combat, audio, handler commands, and emotional distraction." Laura's voice cut in, controlled but firm. "Echo is not an attack-trained dog. He is 8 weeks old. "Which is why this is preliminary," Sullivan replied. "Proceed." Caleb crouched beside Echo and touched 2 fingers to his shoulder. "Stay close, kid." Echo gave a tiny hum, almost too quiet to hear, and Caleb felt it through his boot more than his ears. The first audio file began with distant rifle fire, clean bursts separated by silence. Echo lifted his head. His body stiffened, but he did not run, bark, or sing. Caleb watched the puppy's chest, watched the breathing quicken. Laura's eyes moved to the monitor, reading Echo's pulse. "Stress response rising," she said. Sullivan did not look away from the dog. "Continue." The speakers added helicopter blades, low and chopping, then the muffled thump of simulated concussive blasts. Echo took one step backward, then another. Caleb's hand tightened at his side, but he did not interfere. This was the cruelty of the room. Everyone was watching for proof, while Echo was only trying to understand why the world had suddenly become thunder. Sullivan gave a short nod. "Senior Chief, command sequence." Caleb swallowed his anger. "Echo, sit." Echo glanced up, confused by the sharpness in the air, and sat halfway. "Down." Echo remained frozen. "Speak." The puppy let out a thin whine, not his strange music, not the living hymn from the range, only a frightened thread of sound. Mercer's heavy brow lowered. Evelyn Price wrote something on her pad. Laura stepped forward. "Enough! This is exactly what my report warned against. He is not responding to the audio as a field dog. He is dysregulating." Sullivan's tone hardened. "Doctor, one more stage." Before Laura could answer, the door opened. Everyone turned. Martha Whitaker stood in the doorway, holding Ben's hand. Martha was 69, tall, but slightly stooped from years of farm work and winter chores, with silver hair braided over one shoulder beneath a pale blue wool scarf. Her face was lined and fair, the kind of face wind and grief had both touched, but her blue eyes held a stubborn warmth that had not surrendered to loneliness. Ben stood close to her side, a small 9-year-old boy in a navy winter jacket too warm for California, light brown hair falling over his forehead, pale cheeks dotted with freckles, and gray eyes that looked older than any child's eyes should. His fingers gripped Martha's sleeve with white-knuckled force. Laura exhaled softly. "Martha, Ben." Sullivan turned sharply. "Dr. Bennett, this was not authorized." Laura did not blink. They were invited as part of Echo's emotional response review. Ben wrote the letter included in my supplemental file. Caleb looked at Ben and recognized him from the photograph, but photographs had not captured the silence around the boy. It clung to him like snow. The helicopter audio still thudded through the speakers. Then came another simulated blast, deeper than before. Ben flinched so violently that Martha bent at once, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. His face drained of color. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Caleb saw it happen with the awful clarity of men who knew panic before it had a name. The boy was no longer in Coronado. He was back in Montana, in the storm that had taken his father. Martha whispered, "Ben, sweetheart, look at me." But Ben's eyes had gone glassy, fixed on something no one else could see. Sullivan reached toward the audio control, suddenly uncertain. "Turn it off." But Echo moved before the sound stopped. He ignored Caleb's position, ignored the mat, ignored the command structure, the officials, the test, the whole proud machinery of human intention. He trotted straight across the room to Ben. Not fast enough to startle him, not slow enough to hesitate. He simply went, as if the boy's fear had called his true name. Echo sat beside Ben's shoes, lifted his little head, and rested his chin on the boy's knee. Then he made a sound no one in the room had heard before. It was lower than his puppy voice should have allowed, soft and even, a deep, trembling lullaby shaped not for performance but for shelter. The room seemed to lean toward it. The helicopter audio clicked off, but Echo continued, a warm note rolling through the silence like a small fire taking hold in a frozen house. Ben's breathing hitched. His hand, still trembling, lowered until his fingers touched Echo's uneven ears. Echo closed his eyes and hummed again. Ben whispered something too faint to catch. Martha's face crumpled. Caleb stepped closer but stopped himself, knowing this was not his moment to command. Ben swallowed. His voice came again, clearer, fragile, but real. "He sounds like Dad telling me I'm safe." No one moved. Evelyn Price lowered her pen. Mercer looked down at the floor, jaw working beneath his beard. Ray turned his face away and pretended to inspect a vent. Laura pressed one hand to her mouth. Sullivan stood very still, and for the first time since Caleb had met him, The commander looked less like a regulation and more like a man. Ben knelt slowly, and Echo climbed into his lap with the solemn clumsiness of a priest late to a blessing. The boy wrapped both arms around him and began to cry, not loudly, not helplessly, but like a door opening after being frozen shut all winter. Martha knelt beside them, her scarf slipping from one shoulder, tears bright on her weathered cheeks. "He hasn't said anything about feeling safe since the accident," she whispered. "Not once." Caleb felt Ranger's tag beneath his shirt, cold against his skin. He looked at Echo, at Ben, at the room full of witnesses who had come to evaluate a dog and found themselves evaluated instead. Sullivan closed the folder in front of him. The sound was small, but it ended the battle. "Cancel the Nevada transfer," he said. Evelyn Price looked up. "Commander," Sullivan's eyes remained on Ben and Echo. "This animal is not to be placed in combat suitability testing. Dr. Bennett will draft a revised classification recommendation. Therapeutic response, pilot program, active duty, and family recovery applications." Laura nodded once, too relieved to trust herself with many words. Mercer added quietly, "That's the right call." Ray sniffed. "Look at that. Common sense survived a committee." This time Sullivan heard him. He gave Ray a dry look, then, astonishingly, almost smiled. Martha rose carefully, one hand still resting on Ben's shoulder. "Commander," she said, voice trembling but clear, "I know I'm only a grandmother from Montana. I don't know your programs, but I know a lonely house, and I know that boy. If Echo ever needs a place where he can be a dog and still do whatever holy thing he just did, our farm has room." Caleb looked at her, then at Ben, who was still holding Echo as though he had found a piece of his father's voice inside the puppy's chest. Echo gave one soft hum, peaceful now, and the room remained silent around him, not because of shock anymore, but because every person there understood that a mission had just changed shape. The road into Montana was white by dusk, the first snow falling softly over the fields as if the sky had decided to forgive the earth before night arrived. Caleb Walker drove north in an official Navy transport vehicle with Echo sleeping on a folded blanket across the passenger seat, his small, golden-brown body rising and falling with every peaceful breath. The trip had been approved as a supervised therapeutic placement transfer, a phrase so stiff it almost made Ray Thompson choke when he heard it, but Caleb knew what it really meant. It meant Echo was leaving the machinery of command before that machinery could teach him to be less miraculous. It meant the little dog who had answered gunfire with a song and grief with a lullaby was going to a place where his voice would not be tested, measured, or sharpened into a tool. Caleb kept one hand on the wheel and the other near Ranger's tag beneath his shirt. He had expected the drive to feel like loss. Instead, it felt like carrying a lantern to a house that had been dark too long. Echo woke when the truck turned onto a gravel lane outside Bozeman, Montana. Snow lay over the fence rails in soft white lines, and beyond them stretched a small farm with bare cottonwood trees, a red barn, a porch light glowing amber, and a modest farmhouse with smoke curling from the chimney. At the gate hung a hand-carved wooden sign, fresh enough that the letters still looked pale against the darker grain. Echo's place. Caleb stopped the truck and stared at it for a moment, feeling the quiet majesty of the thing. Not a kennel, not a facility, not an assessment site. A place. Martha Whitaker stepped onto the porch before he could knock. She wore a long gray wool cardigan over a blue dress, winter boots dusted with snow, and her silver braid rested over one shoulder like a rope of moonlight. Her lined face was tired from years of holding grief politely, but her blue eyes were alive with a nervous hope that made her look younger than she had in Coronado. Beside her stood Ben, small and thin in a brown coat too large at the sleeves, his light brown hair tucked under a red knit cap, his gray eyes fixed on the truck with the solemn courage of a child trying not to hope too quickly. When Caleb opened the passenger door, Echo jumped down, sank briefly into the snow up to his little ankles, and sneezed with great offense. Ben laughed. It was not loud, but it was real, a cracked bell ringing after a long winter. Echo heard it and ran to him at once, paws scattering powder, tail wagging so hard his whole body seemed attached to it by mistake. He reached Ben, stopped, and looked back at Caleb, ears uneven, eyes bright, as if asking permission from the man who had pulled him out of the fog. Caleb's throat tightened. He walked over, knelt in the snow, and placed both hands on Echo's small shoulders. "You don't need permission to heal people, buddy," he whispered. Echo pressed his forehead to Caleb's chin, then turned and pushed his nose into Ben's mitten. Ben crouched and wrapped both arms around him. Martha covered her mouth with one trembling hand, and the porch light made every falling snowflake look like a tiny blessing. Caleb stayed that first night because Martha insisted, and because Echo refused to let him leave before supper, placing one paw on Caleb's boot each time he moved toward the door. The farmhouse was small but warm, filled with old quilts, framed photographs, the scent of cinnamon, coffee, and pine wood, and the soft creaks of a place that had survived many winters by learning to bend. On the mantel stood a photograph of Aaron Whitaker, Ben's father, a broad-shouldered man with brown hair, bright eyes, and a grin so open it seemed to make the room larger even from behind glass. Martha noticed Caleb looking. "He never could pass anyone in trouble," she said softly. "That was his blessing, and the way we lost him." Caleb nodded, understanding more than he could say. Echo lay beside Ben under the kitchen table, humming softly whenever the boy's hand slowed on his fur. At one point, Ben whispered, "Do you think he'll like it here?" Caleb looked at Echo, at the carved sign outside, at Martha's hands wrapped around her coffee mug as if warmth were something she was relearning. "I think," he said, "he already knows he was expected." The next morning, Caleb prepared to leave. Snow had stopped, leaving the farm shining beneath pale sunlight. Echo followed him to the gate. Caleb knelt again, this time slower, because goodbye had teeth. He removed Ranger's tag from around his neck and held it in his palm. For a moment, he thought he would keep it forever. Then he looked at Echo standing between Ben and Martha, and understood that Ranger had not saved his life so he could spend the rest of it guarding ashes. Caleb kissed the old tag once, closed his eyes, and slipped it back beneath his shirt. Not yet. Some farewells needed time to become gifts. "You did good, little operator," he told Echo. "Now go do what I couldn't." Echo answered with a low hum that rose into a tiny bark. Caleb walked back to the truck without looking over his shoulder until he reached the road. When he finally turned, Echo was on the porch beside Ben, his head lifted, singing softly into the cold Montana morning. Months passed, and Echo's place became more than a sign. Martha began inviting neighbors first. One widower who brought old dog treats in his coat pocket, 2 children from Ben's school who had lost their mother, a retired sailor who drove 40 miles and pretended he was only there to fix a gate. Echo greeted each person differently. He romped with children, sat quietly beside veterans, hummed near anyone whose sadness had no language, and barked with comic outrage whenever Martha tried to serve him plain kibble instead of the chicken Ray mailed, for morale purposes. Ben changed slowly, the way spring first appears under snow. He spoke in full sentences again. He asked questions. He laughed without apologizing afterward. Martha's kitchen, once a room where silence sat in Aaron's empty chair, filled with footsteps, mugs, stories, and Echo's strange warm music. Laura helped from Coronado, guiding Martha through the first simple therapy protocols by video call, her hazel eyes bright with pride each time Echo settled beside another grieving visitor. Ray sent a wooden plaque he had made himself, the letters uneven but sturdy. "Kindness is still a mission." Commander Sullivan, who would never admit sentiment under oath, approved quiet funding for a pilot canine therapy partnership between the base and Martha's farm. Administrative outreach, he called it. Ray called it a miracle wearing dress shoes. 1 year later, Caleb returned to Montana under a sky full of slow, silver snow. He came in uniform, not because the farm required ceremony, but because he wanted Ranger, Echo, and the man he had become to stand in the same truth. At the gate, Echo's place looked weathered now, darker from sun and storm, with Ray's plaque hanging beneath it. Ben was in the yard, throwing a red ball, laughing as Echo bounded through the snow, no longer the tiny trembling puppy from Coronado, but a strong young German shepherd with a deep sable coat, powerful legs, bright amber eyes, and the same uneven tenderness in his voice. Martha stood on the porch, cheeks pink from cold, looking not cured of grief, but accompanied through it, which was sometimes the holier thing. In the distance, a church bell began to ring from town. Echo stopped, lifted his head, and sang, not to gunfire now, not to fear, to bells, to snow. To the living. Caleb felt the old ache rise, but it did not break him. He walked to the gate, removed Ranger's tag, and fastened it carefully beneath the sign. The metal caught the gray light. Caleb stepped back. "You brought me home too, boy," he whispered, though he was not sure whether he meant Ranger, Echo, or both. Echo ran to him then, pressed against his legs, and gave one bright bark that made Ben laugh and Martha wipe her eyes. Caleb smiled through the cold. Echo had not become a weapon. He had become a home. And in that snow-white field, among a boy's laughter, a grandmother's healed silence, and the song of a dog once abandoned in fog, Caleb finally understood that some missions did not end with survival. Some ended with every lost heart finding its way back to warmth. Echo's story reminds us that miracles from God do not always arrive with thunder or bright light. Sometimes they come quietly, in a trembling puppy, a lonely child's first words, a grandmother's open door, or a soldier finally letting go of guilt. Echo was never meant to become a weapon. He became a home, a warm voice for hearts that had forgotten how to heal. In daily life, we may not rescue a K-9 on a Navy base, but we can still notice the hurting people around us. A kind word, a phone call, a meal, a prayer, or a little patience may become the miracle someone needed. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope. Comment your favorite moment below, tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe for more stories of love, loyalty, and second chances. May God bless you, your family, and your home. Amen.